Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is Jesus' Transcendent Experience. And this is section number 41 of our study of Jesus' life and ministry based on the Gospel of Mark. And the text that we're going to look at today is from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. Although I think I may only read down through verse 8. This is one of the more interesting stories about Jesus' life and ministry, and it gives us some very interesting things to think about. So let's read this text and see what we can learn. Mark says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and went up into the mountains. They were alone, and suddenly Jesus' appearance began to change. His clothes became the whitest white there is. Then Moses and Elijah appeared, and Jesus talked with them. Peter spoke up and said to Jesus, "Teacher, we are fortunate to be here to see this. If you would like us to, we will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter did not know what else to say. He and James and John were too frightened to think clearly. Then a cloud came down and settled just above them. From within the cloud, a voice spoke, "This is my son. I love him very much. Listen to him." And then suddenly Moses and Elijah and the cloud were gone. Only Jesus stood there before the apostles. Now, this is kind of a interesting story. I mean, some people might even think of it as just a little bit spooky. What was going on here? So let's think about the dynamics of this for a minute. They went up into a mountain, just the 4 of them, Jesus taking Peter, James, and John, whom he often took with him. They seemed to be the leaders of the 12, right? And so they got some extra time and extra teaching from Jesus. And so there they were, don't know what they were talking about, but suddenly Jesus' appearance begins to change, and he becomes extremely white, very radiant, and Moses and Elijah are there. Okay? Now, someone says, how did Peter, James, and John know that was Moses and Elijah? Moses and Elijah had been dead very, very long time. They didn't have photography then. There were no pictures. These would have just looked like 2 old guys. How did they know that was Moses and Elijah? We don't know. Maybe Jesus introduced them. I mean, that would be the simplest way, right? Moses, Elijah, Peter, James, and John. Okay, just because the text doesn't say that happened doesn't mean it didn't happen. Okay, none of the Gospels report the idea that we're telling you every single thing that happened, and there was nothing that happened that we didn't tell you about. See, that's not what the Gospels are. And so it really may have been that when Moses and Elijah appeared, that Jesus introduced them to Peter, James, and John. I don't know. And then Jesus, Moses, and Elijah had a conversation. So the next question is, well, what were they talking about? We don't know that either. It doesn't tell us that, right? Some people speculate and say, well, Jesus was approaching the time of the crucifixion. I'm sorry, we had a little bit of a glitch there. I apologize. Well, what I was saying is that Jesus was approaching the time of the crucifixion, and there were serious challenges associated with that. Would he have the faith and the strength to go through it or not? And Satan is trying to keep him from doing that. It was, Satan was trying to get him killed, but at the same time, he was trying to stop him from offering himself as a sacrifice. So, it was a very difficult time for Jesus, and Moses and Elijah were trying to encourage Jesus. Well, that's what some people think. Maybe, I don't know. It's a possibility. Personally, I don't think so. I think a better explanation would be that they were wondering what was going on, and that they, came to talk to Jesus. And people suggest that, excuse me, that Moses represented the law and Elijah represented the prophets, and so together they represent the whole of the Old Testament, and the kingdom of Israel and all that old stuff. And they were two prominent leaders, and they didn't understand the plan. They didn't have foreknowledge like God. They didn't know beyond what had happened up to that point. They didn't know what was going to happen. Any more than the apostles did, or any more than we would be able to know, right? They were limited in their knowledge of future events. So maybe they're asking Jesus, what's going on here? What are you doing? How's this going to turn out? What's the plan? And Jesus perhaps was explaining it to them. Maybe it was something entirely different. We don't know. And so if anybody pretends to be telling you, oh, this is what had happened, this is what, they're just making stuff up. It's their opinion. They don't really know. Okay. The two best options are the ones I just gave you. The one I think, in my opinion, is probably the best answer, is that Jesus was explaining to them what was going on. Maybe Jesus was trying to encourage them, right? Who knows? But other than that, we don't really know what was happening. But the interesting thing then is in the process of this, the interaction between Jesus and Moses and Elijah, there must have been a lull or something. And when Peter speaks up, he says, excuse me, Lord, good thing for us to be here. This is really great that we can see this. If you want, we'll build you 3 shelters. Now, what was the point of that? Well, that was a way of respecting and honoring them. Peter was trying to be polite, right? As far as he was concerned, 3 greatest guys in history: the Messiah, Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, the prophet. 3 of the greatest people in history. And he thought, man, we should do something to honor these guys. We'll build 3 booths, one for each of you, and the cloud comes over and comes down, and from the cloud, the voice says, "This is my son." Now, obviously, they would have known, or there would have been some reference, or maybe it was immediately over Jesus or whatever, so that they knew the voice was referring to Jesus. "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Now, for centuries, commentators have said, okay, this is an illustration of God saying the old, represented by Moses and Elijah, has been set aside. Jesus is bringing something new. Listen to him. The old is done. It's past. It's fulfilled. It's put away. Okay, it doesn't count anymore. Forget it. We're going to go with the new. Right? And that's what Jesus was bringing. All right, theologians and ministers and commentators and scholars, everything have explained that way for centuries, and they are exactly right. There's absolutely no other explanation for that. Okay, that's what the voice was meaning. No, Moses and Elijah are not equal to Jesus. They don't get a special shrine or booth built to them, as one would build also to Jesus. They are not on par. They are not equal. Okay, Jesus is way up here. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is God in the flesh. Moses and Elijah were just human beings. Jesus is not a human being. He's the Son of God. I mean, he is a human, but he's not just a human. Okay, he's both 100% human and 100% God. See, he's a 200% being. Now, Moses and Elijah were not. They were just 2 men, and they were not equal to Jesus. Peter inadvertently had sought to elevate them to the same level of Jesus, and God said, no, that's not going to happen. That's not right. So Peter is silenced, and it wasn't so much of an angry reprimand as it was just a piece of factual information. No, Moses and Elijah are no longer key figures in anything. They are being completely replaced by Jesus. And the old law is being completely replaced by the new covenant, right? So There are many people in the religious community today who like to spend a lot of time in the Old Testament, reading the Old Testament, reading the Ten Commandments, reading some other parts of the law, and thinking this represents what God wants for people today. And it does not. We are not under the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant has been set aside. It was fulfilled. It was set aside. It was replaced by the New Covenant. Right? And that's part of what this whole thing was about. But there are a couple of other things that I think we need to think about as well in relationship to this text. What does all of this really mean? Jesus being transformed into some kind of a spiritual state and being made so very brilliant and white. In other words, the radiance of his divinity is more powerful than the light of the sun, and all this. And he's there, and two dead guys that have been dead for hundreds and hundreds of years, show up, and they're talking to him. What does all this mean? Well, it means, number one, that there is a spiritual world beyond this one, right? That there is a transcendent reality. This world is not all there is. And this life isn't all there is. There's something else on the other side, okay? And there's living people over there. Moses and Elijah had died physically, but they still existed. And they could communicate. They were living beings with an identity. And they could communicate. And they came and they talked with Jesus, right? So when we die, we are transitioned into another phase of life. We call it death, and it's this big scary thing. Ooh. Yeah, but really it's no different than a baby being born. That's a pretty serious transition. The baby doesn't know what's going on, and it's scared, and it's frightened, and it comes out crying. Okay, but we on this side think of it as a great thing. The baby was born. This is a good thing, right? So the baby is transitioned into a new phase of life. Well, after you live in this phase of life for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, whatever, then the physical body is worn out and old, and it lays down and dies. And the real you, the part of you that thinks and wills and determines, and the real you, the spirit you, is transitioned into the next phase of life. And you go on living, just like Moses and Elijah went on living. And who else was over there? Everybody else was over there. Everybody died. Abraham was there. Jacob was there. Joseph was there. All the other guys, they're all over there too. But just two of them showed up, and I think it's interesting. One of them wasn't Abraham. One of them was Moses, and the other was Elijah. Okay? And they're talking with Jesus. And so we need to remember that this life isn't all there is. There's another life beyond. And the reason Jesus came was so that the mistakes we make in this life, the sins that we commit, the mess that we make of things, can be forgiven. It can be erased. It can be washed away. And we can start anew. And we can be saved. So that when we are transitioned into that next phase of life, when the body lays down and dies, right, and the soul is ready to be transitioned into the transcendent realm, the realm beyond, then the sins are gone, and we have a relationship with God, and we continue in that relationship with God on the other side in that transcendent or immaterial reality. See, that's what's really going on here. We're being reminded that in the next life, that really is life. And there are people there, alive, not physically alive, but they're still alive, and they still have an identity, and they can communicate. Okay? The Bible doesn't give us a lot of insight into what's over there, what's out there beyond. But just a little bit. And that little bit ought to be enough for us to know we'd better pay attention to the future and not get too wrapped up in this life, because this life is just temporary. It's going to end, right? But there's another life beyond. And our goal in this life is to prepare for that life. Are you prepared? You think about that. And as you do, remember to read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.